The year is 2154. Humanity lives in a divided state. On the one hand, you have the vast majority of human beings living on planet Earth, a blasted landscape of ruins and destruction. And then a much smaller segment of humanity that lives in the clouds, as it were, above Earth itself, within Earth's orbit, living a life of plenty, of no problems. There's no illness, there's no want, there's no need, there's nothing. This is the scenario in a film that came out about a decade ago called Elysium. Sometimes I've made reference to it. Now, the film itself, starring Matt Damon, is pretty terrible. It's not a well-actualized film, a film that was carried out well in terms of its individual components. But the basic premise of it is something that I see occurring even as we speak and has been occurring for quite some time, this division of humanity. So in this video, I want to talk about this in much greater detail than I typically do. I've talked about the elites. I've talked about the divisions here and there between elites and non-elites. But rarely have I talked about its genesis and its general effects on society. So let's start at the beginning. How did we get to the current state of affairs in 2023? It's a good question, a relevant question. Well, it goes back quite some time. You see, many, many centuries ago, Europe in particular had a feudal system. You had people who owned land and other people who labored under these landowners. This was the serf who labored under the feudal lord, typically. And however much contempt the feudal lord had for the serf, he was nonetheless bound to the serf by certain obligations, both real and imagined. Some of them were religious, probably, but many of them were just pragmatic. It was the feudal lord's obligation to protect and take care of the serf to some degree. And it was the obligation of the serf to give back, say, crops, the yield of agriculture, to the feudal lord. Now, this system persisted for quite some time, until the economy got shaken up. And when it really got shaken up was when the Industrial Revolution hit town. And this really fundamentally changed the nature of the relationship between those who labor and those who offer the labor. There was a decoupling that started in the Industrial Revolution and has continued to this day. The robber barons of the 19th century, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie Mellon, so on and so forth, all these folks existed in a position that was very different, distinct from the feudal lord of, say, the year 1200. And the robber barons, in fact, existed in a position that was much more similar to the people who labor for Jeff Bezos in a warehouse for the sake of Amazon. But it's even worse now. So as technology has proceeded, as the nature of the economy has proceeded, as it's divorced itself from things like agricultural production with a concomitant development of technology that has aided and abetted these other developments, these other branches of labor, other sectors. Well, that's the economic aspect, but it's very important because that sets up the scenario for all the other problems, social, biological, etc., that result from that. And so the real divisions, in particular in the United States, they exist elsewhere in the West, but especially in the United States, have really come down to high degrees of functionality versus lesser degrees of functionality. So a lot of people will talk about elites, and they're going to talk about the meetings at Davos and the people with their shadowy meetings at the Fed, right? And those elites do exist, and they're loosely part of the phenomenon that I'm referring to here. But generally speaking, when I'm talking about elites, I'm talking about high degrees of functionality, meaning high degrees of education, good to excellent incomes, and this is probably the most important aspect as concerns us, the intact family unit. So lower rates of divorce, functional families, two-parent households, children that are not completely messed up, that go on to carry the torch forward in a similar vein and fashion to the parents and their generation preceding them. Now, you might say that's not really what's meant by elite, and I suppose traditionally you're right, but that is the division that has been made manifest in recent decades. When you look outside of the upper class, what do you see? You see increasing dysfunction. You see, across all ethnic and racial groups, increased rates of single-parent households. And we all know that means single-mother households in 95% of the cases. So single-mother households. You see children out of wedlock. And you see the subsequent generations feeding into the cycle doing the same thing. And you see just much less of that in elite circles. So, for example, I've talked about Dave, the distributist, guy I respect. He's a YouTuber. I've talked to him before on a number of occasions, but he's an elite. He earns some kind of six-figure salary. He has a PhD in engineering. He might have another degree as well. And he has a normal family. And he's religious on top of that. That's rare, to be honest. He's a Catholic. But it's an example of somebody who's highly functional overall. There aren't any glaring deficits in his life, at least that we're privy to, versus somebody who's on their third marriage or children of a single mother who haven't seen their father in 20 years or something like that. So I'm going to continue to run with this meme, basically. That is correlating elite with highly functional. Now, this wasn't always the case. It used to be that the middle class used to have a correlation with the things I'm talking about. They didn't have as many out-of-wedlock children, the divorce rates were lower, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of things that have fed into this, including women's liberation, feminism, etc., etc. But really what's necessary to elucidate here is that there used to be a common good, something that people could work towards, that everyone felt they were part of, and that's completely gone. In the case of the United States, well, that's always been a tricky one, but nobody really has a good answer, for example, to the question of what does it mean to be an American? By all accounts, the definition of an American is just somebody who lives in the United States, doesn't break the law, is perhaps a citizen, and pays his taxes on time. Not a grand vision of American identity, I would say. During the Cold War, this was a lot easier for obvious reasons. And so there ceased to be a common narrative that people can draw from. And what seems to have happened is that the elite class that never really needed that narrative to function in a good way has moved on and done what it does, and they're fine. But the middle class and the lowest of classes always needed some kind of common narrative. Whether you frame it religiously, politically, whatever it might be, that narrative is gone. And so they're just left to flounder. Across the United States, we see massive instances of dysfunction, whether it comes to the normalization of shoplifting, i.e. theft, as just a daily part of life, and something that's just part and parcel of the American experience, to the impossibility of finding a date with someone who's not a single mother. I have a close friend who lives in Kansas, and he tells me it's nigh impossible to want a date, to have a date with a woman, say, in her mid-20s to early 30s who's not a single mother. That should tell you something. There's a serious problem in society. These aren't all poor people, but they're middle class in many cases. And getting back to the original point, the difference between the feudal lord and the Jeff Bezos, or even Dave the Distributist, although I think in Dave the Distributist's case, given that he's Catholic, he probably is concerned on some level, a meta level maybe, is that the feudal lord had tangible earthly obligations that he could not ignore. Jeff Bezos doesn't have that. And the many lesser elites don't have that either. In fact, and this is a main point of this video, I don't think many of us fathom how these people view the rest of us, average people. At least I'm average. Like you and me. And maybe you're not average, but I am. There is, at times, a contempt for our ilk. And at other times, it's a curious amusement. So you look at the mating and dating crisis, the phenomenon, say, of inceldom, and you'll get talking heads, one of the most prominent being Chad Williamson, who will express his interest in the phenomenon. But it is a ghoulish academic interest. It's not a visceral interest. It's not an interest of concern in the sense of, wow, this is a real problem. We need to try to figure this out. It's just, aha, that's fascinating. The same is true of many of these academics, William Costello, David Buss. Hell, in the case of David Buss, commonly regarded as one of the fathers of evolutionary psychology, at the tail end of the Me Too movement, he wrote a book titled When Men Behave Badly. Now, he goes on later in the book to explain that, yeah, it's a tiny fraction of men who do these things, but people looking at the title, which is completely sensationalist, are not going to think, oh, well, it's only a tiny fraction of men. The takeaway from that is men are bad. This guy, an academic who's been studying mating and dating for decades, it's his primary area of research, lighting the fire and making it burn even worse than it was before. There's so many instances of this. Ben Shapiro, who, I don't know how often he said this, will talk about GDP and how people just need to move and get better jobs, or they need to make better decisions in terms of the people they meet so they can marry and have a traditional marriage. Well, this coming from a religious fanatic who's a multimillionaire. Okay, does that apply to the vast majority of people? No. And so there's a curious combination of indifference, ghoulish fascination, and contempt for everyone beneath them coming from these elites. And again, I'm not just talking about the elites among the elites, but rather highly functional, well-educated, wealthy people with functional, intact families. They don't care a whit about the rest of us. They don't really care about the dysfunction they're witnessing. Because when they encounter it, what do? They do the logical and rational thing. They flee. What happened, for example, with many of these people, including Ben Shapiro and Joe Rogan in California? Crime, homelessness, ridiculous state taxes, they moved. Ben Shapiro moved to Florida, which, as far as I'm aware, doesn't have a state tax. And Joe Rogan relocated to Austin, which is fast becoming the new San Francisco, and who knows, in 20 years, maybe it will suffer a similar fate, maybe even sooner than that. So when you have options, when you have money, you just run away from the problem because it's not your problem to begin with. But there is a problem you cannot escape. Eventually, as dysfunction runs rampant throughout society, and elites have less and less to do with the common man, or for that matter, and maybe even more importantly, with the common woman, the dysfunction will catch up. They won't see the dysfunction in their own families or their gated communities, but you will end up in an Elysium-like situation. But there are only so many places you can run to. And if dysfunction goes from uncommon to common to frequent, and it overtakes huge sectors of society, there will be knock-on and ripple effects. It's unavoidable. You cannot have a highly functional, quote-unquote, first world country without a, not just economically, but socially, emotionally, culturally functional middle class. Eventually, that will bite them in the buttocks. But that's going to take a really long time. And until then, there is a lot of fecal matter that can hit the fan before that happens. And they will do nothing. Like I said, elites out there, whether it's the Chad Williamson type elite, or the Ben Shapiro, or the Sam Harrises out there, or the academics such as David Buss, they don't care about you. Some of them pretend to. You're just an interesting experiment to them, at best. And at worst, you're worthy of contempt. Most of these people would love for incels and the like to just shut up and for them to never see the light of day, which is probably why so many of them are in favor of anesthetizing huge swaths of the population via drugs, via prawn, via mindless entertainment and video games, because there is no good solution. They don't want to get involved in producing a solution. So let's just get rid of the problem by allowing these people to just fade away in their own little worlds, and we won't need to deal with it. If there's ever been one, there no longer exists a common thread that unites people, a common sense of something to strive towards, and a sense of concern for people outside of your immediate socioeconomic circle, or religious circle, or ethnic circle, or any number of these things. It's bad, and it's going to get a lot worse. And the elites will continue to twiddle their thumbs and prognosticate and offer theories and find it all very amusing, as Chad Williamson is wont to do. Chad Williamson, for example, finds incels absolutely fascinating and mating and dating dynamics absolutely fascinating. Even though he has options galore, it's not reflective of his life. For somebody like him, it's like looking in at a bunch of rats fighting each other for the scraps and finding it all very interesting. Even though he himself is not a rat, they don't give a damn. And the people beneath them are way too discombobulated, disorganized, and just anesthetized, to be perfectly frank, out to lunch to come together and try to do something about that. So the cycle of degeneration and destruction will continue. You cannot ignore the lower 80% of society forever and expect that everything is going to be fine, even as 80% of society falls apart at the seams and you're doing fine. It just can't work like that. That's just a recipe for disaster long term. Anyway, as always, thank you for tuning in. Special thanks to my patrons on Patreon. You guys are the best. You keep the channel alive and going. Without you, there would be nothing. And similar thanks to my donors on PayPal. You guys keep it going as well. And for everyone else, if you can like the video, share the video, leave a comment, sub if you're not yet a subscriber. I've heard that does something on YouTube. I'm still not sure. Until the next time, may the gods watch over you. If I'm still alive, I'll check you out then. Bye-bye for now. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.